Hello everyone. In today's session, we are going to talk about atrial pressure changes during the cardiac cycle. When we study atrial pressure curves, we are essentially watching how the pressure inside the atria change in response to both atrial contractions and ventricular events. So the jugular venous pressure waveform is a reflection of the same changes in the right atrium. So you will often see two discussed together. So let's dive into this particular topic now. First, we will begin with the A wave, which represents atrial contraction. So the A wave is produced when the atria actively contract at the end of the ventricular diastole. This contraction pushes the last portion of the blood, often known as the atrial kick, into the ventricles, slightly raising the atrial pressures during this particular period. So on the ECG, this aligns with the P wave and the PR interval. It is prominent in conditions like tricuspid stenosis because the atria have to contract harder to push blood through the narrowed valves, and it is absolutely absent in atrial fibrillation since there is no organized atrial contractions, and this is what is all about A wave. And next is about the C wave. C wave is a small, brief rise in the atrial pressure that occurs as ventricle starts contracting during isovolumetric contraction. Mechanically, this is due to the AV valves bulging into the atria under the pressures of the ventricular contraction. And this bulging momentarily increases atrial pressure because the volume is decreased even though the valves are closed. And now next one is called as the X descent. So the X descent is a sharp fall in the atrial pressure after the C wave. And two things contribute to this particular descent over here. The first one is the atrial relaxation, that is after the contraction. And second one is the downward movement of the AV ring during ventricular systole, which pulls the floor of the atrium down, creating the vacuum effect, is responsible for this downfall. So this is sometimes called as the ventricular suction effect. It is usually the most prominent downward deflection in the normal venous pulse. And next is about the V wave. So the V wave represents venous return filling the atrium while the AV valves remains closed during ventricular systole. This filling gradually raises the atrial pressure until its peak. And on the ECG, the peak of the V wave coincides roughly with the end of the T wave. When we talk about a clinical note, that is in tricuspid regurgitation, the V wave becomes much larger and taller because blood is leaking back into the atrium from the ventricle during systole. And next is the Y descent. So the Y descent is the fall in the atrial pressure that occurs after the AV valves open. So the blood rapidly flows from the atria into the ventricles, relieving the pressure. So this is normally a smooth downward slope, but in the conditions like tricuspid stenosis, the Y descent becomes slow and blunted because the blood flow is obstructed. So this is what is all about the interatrial pressure curve, we can say. So whenever we are integrating the waves with the cardiac cycle, as a quick review, A wave represents the atrial systole, which is the end of the ventricular diastole. C wave represents the early ventricular systole during isovolumetric contraction. X descent represents the atrial relaxation and downward displacement of the tricuspid valve during systole. And V wave represents the late ventricular systole as the atrium fills against the closed AV valves. And finally, the Y descent describes the early diastole as the AV valves open and blood flows into the ventricles. By this, we conclude this important topic of interatrial pressure curve.